Good evening, everyone. My name is Michelle Stempian. I'm the Education and Community Programs Manager at the Holland Museum. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. We haven't done one of these in a while, so hopefully all of our technology will be working well. But bear with us if anything goes awry. But thank you for joining us on Zoom this evening for our next installment of our Tales from the Archive series, which focuses on topics of local Holland history. Thank you to the Michigan Arts and Culture Council and the National Endowment for the Arts for their continuing support of this program. Before we begin, I have a few announcements and information to share about some upcoming programs and events. Also, we ask that you stay on mute throughout the presentation. You can also feel free to turn off your camera if you'd like. Please, if you have any questions, put those questions into the chat, and we will use that chat feature at the end to have a discussion, and we'll read off those questions. We are also recording this program, and it will be available in a few days on our website, hollandmuseum.org. Before I make further announcements, I'd like to take a moment to honor the land that the Holland Museum and the Capon and Settlers House Museums occupy. The Holland area surrounds Lake Makatawa, ancestrally known to the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Peoria nations as Mekatugami, or Black Lake. Each nation has their own rich cultural traditions and beliefs that still survive today. We, the Holland Museum, acknowledge that this land is sacred, and we commit to honoring the land and the indigenous peoples who have stewarded it for generations through continuing education, partnerships, and self-reflection. Thank you. Our next exhibition at the Holland Museum, which opens on November 17th, is Newsflash, the story of journalism in Holland. This exhibition reflects on the history of local media outlets, including the Holland Sentinel and WHTC. In addition, this exhibition explores the evolution of journalism and the important role that it has played in developing the city of Holland. Many of the objects on display come from the collection of local photographer, journalist, and historian Randy van der Water. You won't want to miss this exhibition. And the Holland Harbor Lighthouse, which you may recognize, it's known as Big Red, but it was, maybe you didn't know that it was not always big, not always red, and not always a lighthouse. On Thursday, November 9th at 7 p.m. at the Holland Museum, join Valerie Van Heest, local maritime historian and author, John Groenberg, president of the Holland Harbor Historic Lighthouse Association, and Bill Tazelaar, commission board member and maintenance advisor, as they share their insider's look into the history of Big Red, as well as its current restoration and ongoing maintenance. And this is a free program. We do hope that you register for it, and we hope to see you next Thursday at the museum. And in connection with our Newsflash exhibition, we will be doing a program on Thursday, December 7th, featuring local media personalities, past and present. Cassandra Leibrink, Lupita Reyes, Gary Stevens, and Paul Van Kolken will discuss their media careers, important news stories they have covered, and the challenges and joys of covering the news in Holland. Again, this is a free program, but we encourage you to register in advance, and that will be Thursday, December 7th at 7 o'clock. There are a lot more programs in the coming months, so I encourage you to visit our website, hollandmuseum.org, for more information and dates. And how can you become more involved with the Holland Museum? Donations of any amount help keep our admissions low and to offer these programs like these at little or no cost. We have a donation box throughout the museum, or you can use the link at the bottom of your screen to give a donation to the Holland Museum. You can also become a volunteer. We have something for everyone's interests and schedule. Or become a member. A family membership, which includes children or grandchildren, pays for itself in 2 visits. And a premium membership includes the North American Reciprocal Museum Program, which includes access to over 1,000 museums and cultural institutions. HollandMuseum.org has all the information on how you can become more connected to the Holland Museum. And I also wanted to mention an important event coming up in 2024. You may not be aware that 2024 is the 150th anniversary of the Capon House. The Capon House was the home of Isaac Capon, the first mayor of Holland, and his family. To start this year, 2024, off right, you could start it with a beautiful commemorative 12-month calendar celebrating this big anniversary. Each month features photos from inside and outside the house, also features important Capon family dates, and also features a family tree. For a minimum $25 donation per calendar, you can have one of these wonderful calendars, and it's limited quantities, so you don't want to wait. There is a link at the bottom of the screen, but I will also put the link into the chat, so you can have it that way as well. This is another way to support the great work the museum is doing. So on to tonight's program. It is my pleasure to welcome back Professor Michael Douma to speak about this very curious and unique folk history of Holland. Michael Douma is a graduate of Hope College, class of 2004, and he earned his PhD in history from Florida State in 2011. He is currently an associate professor at Georgetown University's Business School, where he teaches courses in economic history of slavery and globalization. He has authored 4 books, edited 4 more, and has published numerous articles on the history of the Dutch in the United States. So please welcome Professor Michael Douma. So I'm going to turn off my screen, and Michael, you can start sharing yours.
Great, thanks, Michelle. I'll share it in a minute. You'll see my slides long enough. Maybe you'll start seeing my face in the beginning for a few minutes. I just want to thank everyone for showing up. I recognize a number of you in the audience, and I want to, in particular, thank Linda Kaiser, who's here. She helped with this project, getting this going. And when Michelle introduced this as the Tales from the Archives series of presentations, I thought this is particularly ironic and interesting, because what I'll be talking about today are literally folk tales that I found in a manuscript in the museum. And this dates back to my time at Hope College. I spent 4 years working for the Joint Archives of Holland. I spent a few years after that working on and off for the Van Raalte Institute, associated with Hope College. And at that time, I was writing my dissertation, which is on Dutch American history. And so from about 2000 to 2010, that decade was really my Holland, Michigan archives decade. I basically lived in the archives in Holland, Michigan for 10 years. And in a way, I've moved on from that kind of research, but I keep going back to it and thinking about other things connected with it. Sometime, I'm not sure exactly when, 2002, 2003, I was doing research in the museum, the Holland Museum, and I discovered this manuscript from Ray Nies, and I just thought it was so interesting and so useful. And I cited it many times in the little articles that I was writing. Bob Swierenga, who I helped, I was his assistant for a bit as he wrote his grand history of Holland, his 3-part history. He cited this work and found it really useful. And at some point, I began typing it up. So it was this long form, old 1940s paper that had been on a typewriter, this long, like legal size paper. And I was able to get copies of it made from the Holland Museum at the time. And I spent weeks at home digitizing this by typing it up. And so for, I don't know, I guess 15 years or more, I sat on this digital version of this very useful historical source for Holland, Michigan, and Dutch American history. And I was able to use it for search terms. So if I was ever writing about one thing about Dutch immigrants or the other, I could search for that term and there it would come, and I'd have a great quote from Ray Nies. And I really did think, and I still think, that Ray Nies is probably the best writer in the Dutch American tradition. I mean, I know there's some great famous writers like Peter de Vries and others. Maybe they have a stronger claim for it, but Ray Nies is certainly the best amateur unpublished writer that I've discovered. And so for years I boasted and talked about how great this was and used it. And then finally, a few years ago, I convinced Bob Swierenga that this really was valuable and worth publishing. And so Bob joined me. And last year, I'll start sharing my screen now so you can see it. Last year, from the start, there we go. Last year, Bob Swierenga and I finally published this discovered manuscript as an edited book, which is now available on Amazon for $20, a black and white version. We did a color version at first, but it turned out to be too expensive. And so we edited the manuscript very carefully, made it, kept the words of the author, but corrected some of his grammatical little mistakes and typos and things, and then added photographs to the story as well. And then if any of you know Bob Swierenga, and I assume many of you do, living in Holland, Michigan, you know that he's very exact and he likes footnotes. And so we added a lot of information and footnotes to help provide more information about the manuscript, about the author, and some of the stories that he tells. Now, I was adamant from the beginning with Bob that I wanted something in the title with the word folk, F-O-L-K, folk. And I had spent an earlier, I don't know, 5 or 6 year period of my life just completely immersed in the field of American folklore or American folkloristics. And I always had this strange feeling that the Dutch Americans and the West Michiganders, that we didn't have a lot of good folk tales. There are stories that all of you probably know that you share with each other growing up in the same locality, right? And I grew up in Grand Rapids, and we have some stories. And if you meet somebody from there, you might say, do you remember that story about that person and what they did? And they'll say, yeah. And then that finds a commonality, right? And it's these folk stories that they usually exist only in spoken form. And after a few generations, they evolve, and eventually they might disappear as they're forgotten or people move in and out of the community. Holland, Michigan had lots of folk stories, just like everyone else, and many of them did disappear. But Ray Nies captured a lot of them through his own eyes. And so folk stories and ideas that were floating around the community ended up coming to him, and he put them down into paper and saved, I think, this just amazing sense of the culture of everyday people in Holland, Michigan. And so it's a folk history because it's not a history that he wrote based on archival sources or research. It is all the stories that he learned from living in the community and from his own experiences and from things that other people told him. And so they're not correct or exact the way that a professional historian would hope for them to be, but they are illustrative of the feelings of the communities. And sometimes with folk stories, maybe they are a little embellished, but we don't always know fact from fiction in the folk stories. And they do highlight things about the community, show purpose and interest in what people are thinking about. So I'm going to do a few things tonight in this presentation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the author, Ray Nies. And first of all, let me say, last year I presented for the Holland Museum online, and I talked about one character that appeared in Ray Nies's book. The entire presentation was about, it was the legend of the Black Dutchman. And it's a story of a African-American living in Holland, Michigan, who supposedly spoke Dutch and used to surprise people. And that whole story was extracted from this book. And I researched that and wrote about that once. I'm not going to talk about that at length because I did already talk about that last year. But in that presentation last year, I also presented a little brief overview of Ray Nies. So tonight I'll talk a little bit more about this author. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what folk is and why this is such an important topic for understanding our local history. And then I'm going to give you some examples of Ray Nies's writing from this book to try to convince you of a few things: that this guy is a great writer, that he's funny, that he's insightful, and that he's important as a person who recorded our local history in a different way. All right. So this first image that I'm showing you is Ray Nies's family, and this is when he is a young boy, and he had so many brothers, it's hard for me to remember, but I left the key on the bottom, and it looks like Ray is the third one. He's the little boy standing in the back, who you can see quite well. Now, he was born in Saugatuck. His father was a veteran of the Civil War. His father was a bugler. He had, used the instrument of the bugle as he went into, I think ended up marching with Sherman in the war, even went across Georgia, but he had been in Tennessee and been everywhere in the war. And his father was very entrepreneurial and came back to Saugatuck and opened a hardware store. And so Nies grew up the first few years of his life in Saugatuck. And when he was a teenager, his father moved the family from Saugatuck to downtown Holland, Michigan, where they opened up another hardware store. Here you see an image of it, John Nies's hardware store. And eventually it became John Nies and Son, Nies and Sons. And then eventually Ray Nies himself took this over. And this is, I used to think this was the same location as the Fogelsang's hardware, which is now that bar there on the corner. But this is actually, I think, where it's like right next to that shoe store, or is that shoe store, Locker Rutgers? It's right in that area on the north side of 8th Street, where the coffee shops are. And so Ray spent his entire life working at this hardware store, first for his father, and then as the proprietor of the store himself. And he would watch people coming up and down Main Street. He was, I wouldn't say he was gossipy, but he was certainly talkative and intelligent, and people would stop and tell him stories. But he also just saw history passing in front of his windows. He was on 8th Street when World War I ended, and he tells you what the celebrations were like and how everybody was reacting. He was down there when certain crimes happened, so he witnessed them and could tell you about them. He saw the strange people of town walk up and down the street, so he has a description of what people look like. Things that you're not going to find in the normal histories that, for much of the 20th century, our histories of Holland, Michigan were focused on our politicians, our ministers, our immigrant leaders. And there's no disrespect from Nies towards those. Well, there's a little bit of disrespect towards some of the lawyers in Holland, Michigan, which is a great aside that he has from time to time. But it is a kind-hearted history of people in the area as well. In producing this book with Bob, we also did research into the hardware store itself. And they advertised a lot in the Dutch newspapers in the area. And so here you see they did a little bit of everything. They sold wood stoves and heaters. They're advertising saws and hammers, everything else. And there you have the address, 43rd East 8th Street, back when phone numbers were just 4 digits in the 1930s and 40s. And here's Ray Nies again as a teenager or a young adult, and then around about 1950, towards the end of his life. And here you see him with a pipe and a coat and a hat as a older gentleman there. Now, there's a few stories about Nies that I think are interesting to describe his personality a bit more. And one of them is that he was a terrible driver. I have a theory. I tell my students a lot. My theory is that on average, the average driver on the road today is better than drivers in the past and is continuing to get better. And everybody thinks this is wrong, right? Because we see all these terrible drivers around us every day. The worst drivers on the road are the ones that are right in front of us or right behind us. But the truth is, in the 1920s and 30s, everybody on the road was a new driver, right? And so imagine not just all the 16-year-olds being new drivers, but the 60-year-olds being new drivers as well. Everybody getting in the car for the first time, running into each other. And if you search for information about Ray Nies in the newspapers, you discover that he was in a lot of car accidents. This one in Dutch says, Ray Nies's car came around the corner of 7th Street and River Avenue and got into a crash with the auto of this other man. The second car was very badly damaged. Now, unfortunately, Ray Nies also had 2 of his children get hit by cars. I think one of them died and one of them survived on the street. And so it's this sad history of, even in the book, when he's sitting down to write this, 1940 or so, behind a typewriter at his home on River Avenue, there's a sense of loss. His parents had died, his wife had died, and some of his children had died as well. And so he's, in one way, a sad figure who's got this difficult history. He was also a saver. He was quite intelligent about economics and loans and government inflation and all these types of things. And so he was sort of a pillar, I think, of his family and of just the sort of old Dutch conservative Hollander living in the city, working his days in and out without much complaint. Here's another one, just a story of one of his other child dying of I think a sickness. I'm looking for the answer there, but yeah, the boy was John and he died at 3 years of age, so he had 2 young children die. Okay, now what do I mean by folk history? So Ray, I said, wrote this, and it's not a regular academic history, it's a folk history. I mean a couple of different things. A lot of times when people hear folk, they think of the people, so there's like a populist element to it, or a lot of times people think of folk music, a whole genre of music that reflects common people and old stories. But among academics, it means a few other things. So I would say folk is partially in contrast with elite styles. And so the style of elite historians might be to write a book about the geography and the politics. Here you have a folk history, which is about the people themselves and their culture. And when we talk about folk, I don't just mean stories. It could also be architecture, for example. So in this picture in the Great Plains, you see folk architecture, which is a style of sod house that exists only in a certain region, that reflects certain ideas about house building from a particular society adapting to this environment. Folk is limited in geography and doesn't stretch across the entire nation. It's particular from one place. Folk knowledge is passed on through generations. And so these stories that Ray has, like I said, come from his father, his mother, the stories from even before he was around. So you get in this book some of the earliest memories from the village of Singapore next to Saugatuck, because his mother was one of the early settlers as a child in the 1850s in Singapore. And so the knowledge is coming. Ray is sort of the conduit for all of this cultural knowledge from his family, all of the jokes of the community that come through him and are recorded. And so it's folk is, once again, not just in music or in stories, but is in the way we build things or how we name our children. It's the patterns of particular life of culture. Folk is also limited, so it doesn't stretch indefinitely. If it stretches too far, it becomes national culture or popular culture, and it's no longer the folk. And so there's always overlap between the two. Ray has some stories in here that I think come from other national influences, but his life is very focused in West Michigan. You know, he's I think a good representative of a person who spent most of his life there, lived there his entire life, really understands the people of the area. And folk ideas, folk knowledge of an area is persistent, right? Stuff that's fleeting, that just comes and goes, is not a folk knowledge. It's just superficial knowledge. Folk knowledge also evolves, and so some of the stories that Ray Nies gives have probably in his mind different versions, different instantiations. And in fact, in the edited version of the manuscript that we have, that we were working from, it was his typewritten manuscript from 1940-ish. He also had handwritten notes. As he learned more things, he would add to the story. You know, so one of the stories in his book, he talks about this. Apparently, this was popular 150 years ago or something, that children, when they would go swimming, they stole other children's clothes and they tied knots in those clothes as tight as possible, the wet clothes. And so the boys would run back to their clothes and they couldn't put them back on. And the only way that they could was if they took their teeth to bite on the knot of that shirt and pull it back apart. And so there was a folk song or motto that they would say called "Chaw Raw Beef," and there was various versions of this that I discovered in newspapers in mostly the Midwest Pennsylvania area as well. Folk is also organically derived. So I mentioned that the Dutch Americans don't have a lot of folk tales. I mean, we do have things like Hans Brinker and the Silver Skates, but I don't think of that as a folk story. Of course, it's not Dutch American, it's Dutch. But there are, excuse me, I lost my train of thought. There's this old distinction a historic or a scholar in the 1950s made between folklore and fake lore. So folklore is that which is organically derived, and there's various versions of it floating around, and people like the Brothers Grimm go out there and record it and turn it into real stories, but it's living out there among the people. And then fake lore are the stories that are invented, like apparently Paul Bunyan and his Blue Ox was a mostly invented story that was then told to everyone as if it were a folk tale. Like, oh, everybody's been saying this for years, but apparently this was a mostly made up story. So Ray Nies's story is not made up. It's organically derived from the people around him. And then this is another way to think about the difference, and I don't want to belabor the point, but folk is limited geographically, but it persists for a long time. And so the opposite of folk in some senses is pop. Pop culture is expansive but fleeting, whereas folk culture is limited in size but enduring. Okay. Now, I want to introduce to you some of the folk characters in Nies's story. And I'm going to give you short readings about each one of these people that Ray deals with in his book. We have first, by far my favorite character in the book, whose name is Piet Van Liere. He spells his name differently a few different times. And I describe him as a perpetually tipsy country veterinarian. He's an old Dutch immigrant who can fix any horse, any cow, any dog in the county, but he's pretty severely alcoholic. He's also a very kind man, and he works for very little, but he's almost like a Rip Van Winkle character. He is the prime folk story that keeps coming back in Ray's work. He's got a chapter on him and a few different sections that mentions him as well. Nik Fyte, just another one of many examples from the book. I'll read a short thing from him about him as well. And he was from this family of, I wrote, pugnacious and conniving farmers, always causing trouble at the county fair, every year getting into fights there. And he would train all year, and he would always win the county's greased pig catching contest, right? I mean, talk about something that does not appear in the normal histories of any county, the greased pig catching contest. And then third, we have Professor Bailey, this sort of absurd figure down at Ottawa Beach who had all sorts of different careers, one of which was teaching people how to swim, but he also would trick people, and there's a story of him teaching a woman's dog how to swim, and as you all know, dogs swim naturally, so he didn't even have to teach the dog, just trick the woman. And then another character I'll read real quickly a thing about is Doc Hoy, who was one of the good storytellers, a kind way of saying liars, from early Holland, Michigan. All right, so let me start with a reading on Van Liere. Turn to my page 75 here. And so this is just 2 paragraphs from Nies talking about this drunk veterinarian, and I found a picture of him. So here's Van Liere when he died. He was 96 years old, and here he is in the Holland City News. And I love this sort of grainy, ethereal, ghostly image of him because it matches the story of the man so well, and sort of mystery that surrounds him. Wrong page, let me find it. 94. All right, here's just a decent description of something about this Piet Van Liere. So Ray writes, in the late afternoon, summer and winter, this thin old form of a man could be seen slowly driving his old black horse Frank down Main Street on his way home, followed often by a crowd of children. He might seem to be somewhat intoxicated, but who could be sure of it? He would turn his face to one side of the street and then to the other, looking for people on the sidewalk. And as soon as he saw anyone, or if the walks were crowded with shoppers, so much the better. It mattered not if he had seen them before, rich or poor, high or low. He would shout to them at the top of his querulous old voice, which was shrill and penetrating, but not very loud, though he did his best. And he could be heard at some distance over the street, yelling, hello, 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 'tis een kat in Amerika, which is Dutch for something like, it's terrible in the United States. So these words he cried over and over as he drove along the mile or more of the little Dutch city. Town people were used to him and his queer ways and paid him little or no attention, but some of the upper crusters would raise their eyes and shake their heads in disapproval as he passed along. But his ways became so firmly established through the years that old Pete was never expected to do or be any different. I must have seen him go down the main street almost every day for 30 years or more, always yelling, hello, hello, 'tis een kat in Amerika. And I do not ever remember seeing him when I could swear that he was sober. Neither, however, could one say that he was drunk, and yet it is said that he lived well over 90 years, maintaining successfully for most of those years that amazing neutral condition or balance or equilibrium almost exactly between those two extremes, neither sober nor drunk. At the time when my knowledge of Pete began, in the last decade of the 19th century, it was quite the fashion for professional men, doctors, lawyers, and ministers to wear high or plug hats, and the rest of their wearing apparel was in accord, all quite genteel and formal, and in the latest style. Oftentimes, the greater the quack, the finer his habiliments, but not so with Piet. His appearance was anything but stylish, with a large black hat, baggy, worn-out suit on his thin body, at least 2 sizes too large, and of course, never cleaned or pressed, that is, never since it left the maker. Over this suit was usually worn the same old black rubber raincoat in all seasons, rain or shine, summer or winter. How many years this apparel lasted him without having to be replaced is not known, but it is known that he never seemed to wear anything new or different in fashion, and if he ever got anything new, it would seem that its very newness would have attracted attention, but nothing like this was ever noticed. And appropriately, the equipage that carried Piet around, the old horse, the dilapidated harness, and the buggy were all in closer harmony, a match to each other and to old Piet himself in looks. Right? So in that description, I think you can note a few things about Ray's style, is that he really gets at the essence of the person. It's the clothes, it's the attitude, it's the aura of each person. And so his stories have beginnings and ends, and these characters are active and doing things, but he always sets them up first as you need to know what this person is like, and that I think also as a folk history differs from a lot of traditional history in which we as historians cannot get at the essence of what human beings are like from 150 years ago. It's difficult because we don't have those sources that really tell us about their personalities. And I think that's one of the more fascinating elements of what Nies is doing. Let me give you another example of this from, I was going to do the greased pig competition, but I don't think I actually have that one prepared. So I'll do another one. Professor Bailey, page 164. Let me tell you about this guy. All right. Another description of a man who, not in Holland, Michigan proper, but out on Ottawa Beach, Professor Bailey, who started calling himself Professor Bailey, world famous swimming teacher. And the man had cards handsomely printed to that effect, which he distributed all around the resorts. He was a big, husky, dark chap, and in his distinctive and startling bathing suit when on the beach, looked most imposing with the rows of big, shiny prize medals fastened across his brawny chest. Here perhaps an attempt at least ought to be made to try to describe that wonderful bathing suit. It was more than a mere bathing suit. You could call it an ensemble. He wore no trunks, as did other swimmers, but in their place a pair of tights, such as circus performers wore, which not only covered his legs full length, but his feet as well. The color of his lower garment was jet black. The upper part of his body was covered by a pullover sweater or shirt. By way of contrast to the jet black tights, the color of this upper garment was a bright canary yellow. Around his middle, where the black tights and yellow sweater met, he wore a broad, vivid crimson silk sash, tied in a bow knot at his side, with its fringe ends hanging down to his knees. The complete costume was something of a cross between the garb of a circus performer and that of a Spanish bullfighter. The later influence predominated, and truly, he was later found to have had plenty of bull in his nature too, as much, yes, much more than there was to be found in the sandwiches that he dispensed to the public. And so, like I said, Professor Bailey for years was a fixture down on Ottawa Beach, and he sold hamburgers, he sold hot dogs, he taught people how to swim, but he was something of a huckster. And this is a character you don't find Professor Bailey in the Holland Sentinel or the Holland City News. It's one of those guys who maybe he was down at the beach for 5 or 10 years, but everybody in town remembered him and knew of him. And I think Nies captures him in that description, but also in some of the stories about him as well. And so that's an important element of folk history. Let me give you just one more. This is a story about a man named Doc Hoy. And Doc Hoy, I said, competed for being one of the greatest liars in Holland, Michigan. That's a high distinction. Holland, Michigan's greatest liar. And about Hoy, it says that one time he was sitting in the store, and the men were talking about how good and fast their horses were. Most everyone then had a horse and buggy in those days, and some horses were pretty good, and some were so skinny and bony that you could almost hang your hat on some of their projecting bones. They were all bragging, more or less, about how fast their horses could go. Old Doc kept quiet until the rest got through. Then he spoke up and said in his easy, low, drawling voice, "Well, you fellers, maybe you've got good horses, and maybe they're as good as you say, but none of them, not one, can come up to my doll." Why, he said, I started to drive to Allegan just the other day and had just left Saugatuck when a sudden terrible rainstorm was coming up from over Lake Michigan. I had just left Saugatuck, he continued, when I saw the heavy rainstorm moving up behind me, and it was coming mightily fast with a heavy wind behind it. Looked like my horse and me were in for a good soaking, but I sped my horses up, and then my good old doll really traveled, and that rainstorm falling just an inch behind me all the way to Allegan. Yes, boys, I kept just an inch ahead of that rainstorm all the way to Allegan. And when I got there, I had a foot of water in the bottom of my buggy, but there wasn't a drop that fell on me or my horse. No, sir, not a drop. I kept just 1 inch ahead of that storm. Right. These types of tall tales and stories can be found throughout the book. And some of them, I believe, Ray is inventing wholesale, but there's some of them that I get the hint that they exist elsewhere, even though I haven't been able to find them. Sometimes I'm just so surprised that this is the only version of the story that I can find anywhere in American history. So one example of this, for instance, is an old story that Ray gives about a Native American and a white settler in West Michigan. And it so happens that one fall, the Native American keeps stockpiling firewood. And they go and ask him, or first they ask the settler, "You're stockpiling all this firewood. Why are you stockpiling so much?" And he says, "Well, I went over and saw the Native American, and he knows a lot about nature, and he knows it's going to be a cold winter, and he's stockpiling firewood." Okay. So then he goes and asks the Native American, "Why are you stockpiling firewood?" And he says, "Well, see that white settler over here? He's got a barometer and all those fancy tools. He knows that it's going to be a cold winter. And so he's stockpiling firewood, and I'm learning from him." Right. And I'm certain that that kind of story exists elsewhere. But I simply haven't been able to identify it in other sources. And so I wonder to what extent Ray is inventing some of these stories or taking them from other people and what he's heard. And as a true folk writer, it's probably a combination of the both. Now, if Hank is still in the audience, a quick shout out to Hank A, geography professor. Another of this folk history that I find particularly fascinating is the sense of a geographical region of the folk. All of these stories happen in the Dutch colony. And so, in West Michigan, we have divisions based on counties, which are not too important to many of us. I mean, I grew up on the border of Kent and Ottawa, and I never really paid attention to it. But the real sense of the community was the extent of the Dutch-speaking areas around in the county. And so, for example, the old drunk veterinarian would take his horse from Holland, and he would pretty much go as far as 20 miles away, anywhere in the Dutch-speaking areas. And there's this sense that you go further, you're into the wilderness, you're into the outside with different types of people. And so, yeah, quite often in this book, you'll see references to these types of places, including Saugatuck, where he grew up, but not too much further. And I think it shows this as a whole, as a cultural unit, rather than a political or political county city type unit. You know, the distinction between Holland and Zeeland in the mind of the culture might be different than in the mind of the political historian. When I used to teach American immigrant history, and here you see this map of the areas where the Dutch settled in the Midwest. And the Dutch Americans, we never created a name for this region that the Dutch settled, because it's sort of like an archipelago, it's spread out. But the Swedish, who had, fairly similar settlement patterns, the Swedish called their land in America, they called it Vesterheim, which means the Western home. And I think that's just such a curious way of thinking about it. And if you read the old Dutch sources and the letters that they wrote to each other and where they traveled at different times of the years, or where they moved, if they moved from one community and one church to the other, it was within this Dutch archipelago in the Midwest. And so places like Pella and Sioux Center feature just as large as Chicago in this imaginary geographical mind, right? And I just think this is really emphasized in Ray Nies's work as well, that there's this sense of this Dutch cultural community that's geographically bound in West Michigan, and in which, for example, Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo, Zeeland are much more important on the geographical mental map than are Detroit and New York City and Chicago and much larger, more influential places. Now, I presented this summer in Chicago at our Dutch History Conference, and there I talked about the opportunity for future types of research. I'm really a supporter now of this idea that there are primary sources hidden in archives that deserve their day in the sun, that deserve to be published and produced. And one of them, I'll mention here because it's another Holland Museum archives source, is the diary of Hoyt Post. Hoyt Post was an American. He was, 18, 19, 20 years old in 1848, hanging out in Holland, Michigan among the Dutch when he wrote a diary. Now, this diary has disappeared as far as I know. Nobody seems to know where it is these days, but it came through the Holland Museum in the 1970s and was typed out. Now, how accurate this typescript of the original manuscript is, it's not entirely clear, but it seems to be pretty decent. And I think this Hoyt Post manuscript is another one that just offers incredible insights into the people in the city, in the stuff that was going on, and the attitudes of the early settlers. Now, Hoyt was an American who was not very happy with the Dutch. He was not very happy with his situation, living with his brother and his brother's wife in Holland, Michigan, as the settlement was started. And he eventually got up, left, went to Grand Rapids, and became an accountant. Now, my father was an accountant in Grand Rapids, and I cannot think of a more boring occupation than a Grand Rapids accountant, but Hoyt seemed to think that was the way to go. All right. So through my work, but also the collaboration of the Holland Museum, the efforts of Bob Swierenga to help me edit this, others in West Michigan that helped, some of whom I've mentioned that are here watching today, this book came together as a source that's now available for others in the community to read. And so I think it's once again, Tales from the Archives is the theme for this presentation series. And here is a real good example of this. And I think we need to train historians, museum archivists, etc., to be aware of these types of important finds that are in archives. They're not incredibly common, but they're not incredibly rare either. They're out there and they're worth looking for. Now, I wouldn't have been able to identify this as something particularly fascinating or unique had I not already spent a lot of time researching the history of Hope College and of Holland, Michigan. And so it takes, I think, a certain background in history to identify the good stuff. I often tell my students this story, if you're good at something, like let's say you're good at playing the piano and you hear somebody else play the piano, you know immediately whether that person is better or worse than you, right? Same thing in a lot of other parts of your life. Whatever you're an expert in, you watch somebody else and you can identify how good they are at it fairly quickly. And so I think that's a skill that historians need to develop. We need to find primary sources that can be useful and stand out on their own and provide something to the community. Because, for example, Bob Swierenga's History of Holland, Michigan is, I think, just fantastic. And it's got so many names and it's got so many stories, and anything you want to learn about your part of the city, you can learn in that book. But in this folk history, you also get these additional elements. You get to understand what Garrett Diekema might have been like, the lawyer, politician, in everyday conversation, or what the fact that much of this book tells stories about alcoholism and drunk people in Holland, Michigan, and that's not supposed to be part of the story, right? But I think that's an honest perspective, and I think Nies treats it really well. There's a few parts in the story that we had to tone down or cut out a little pieces of that were a bit racist, for example. But I think a lot of that reflected more the attitudes of his era and not so much his views in particular. So he's very open about communicating and liking Polish immigrants, for example, African Americans. He's got all these other examples of people that are coming in and out of town. Again, people that might not have been very well picked up by our histories or even by our census. We don't have very good information on some of these people. And then he draws out this, this great like micro history of a person, really giving you a demonstration of the whole attitude of a person living in the city in roughly 1890 to 1940 is the period of concern, with some references further back from his parents. So let me leave it there. I know we have 30 minutes or something for discussion and comments. And so I want to thank you again for sitting through that. And thank you, Michelle, for inviting me to this. And now I see others that I know.
Thank you, Michael. We really appreciate such an interesting talk about something that got hidden in our archives and we didn't know anything about it. So thank you to you and Bob for bringing it to light. I did double check, and actually the book is in the Holland Museum shop. So if anyone's inspired now after Michael's talk to pick it up, you can also pick it up at the Holland Museum. So if you have any questions for Michael, go ahead and put those into the chat. And we'll give you a minute to do that so that we can share those with Michael. And actually, Michael, I had a question while we're waiting. Did you have, after doing all this research in the typing of everything, the editing, did you have a favorite story or character from the book?
Well, I said it during the presentation, and I'll stick with it, that Piet Van Liere, the drunk veterinarian, is such a hilarious character, and it's so well drawn out, and it repeats itself in the book so many times that I really don't want to overdo it, but I think it's equivalent of a Washington Irving, Rip Van Winkle, or Headless Horseman. I think it's a character that once you read it, you never forget this guy. Piet Van Liere had a crooked finger, always like this. And it was crooked because he got drunk and he was out last night, one night in the ice and snow, and his hand got just devastated from the conditions. This actually turned out to be a benefit to him because he always drank alcohol out of a jug, and the jug just happened to fit his crooked hand, and he would drink it way of throwing the jug up like this. And so every time you would see him on his old horse with his heavy raincoat, skinny old horse, he'd have that alcoholic jug next to him just to take a sip of the old brandy. You know, these kinds of little clues about the guy's personality. And then when you hear the stories of him himself, Ray is very sympathetic to him. The guy had problems, but he was also a very nice man who would fix horses for very cheap. So long as you brought him something to drink that was usually supposed to be for the horse. You know, the only way I can fix this horse is if I have a little bit of alcohol, but he would take a sip of it while the guy walked away, you know. And so I think we can maybe recognize some of, you know, the people we know in some of these stories, these old little curmudgeons.
Absolutely. Okay, so first question in the chat, are there any stories about the lighthouse or lighthouse keepers in the book?
Trying to think. I don't think so in particular. I mean, there are some stories of the shoreline. So for example, Ray Nies in the 1940s or something actually wrote into the Holland City News to tell the story of that when he was a boy, he would skate from Saugatuck up to Holland or walk the coast from Saugatuck to Holland. And he was the last person to ever see a piece of the village of Singapore, Michigan, which is on the end of the Kalamazoo River there in Saugatuck. And the reason why he says he was the last person is that he and his brother friend were walking the beach one night and they couldn't make it home. And they spotted sticking out of the sand the peak of the last house that had been covered by the sand dunes in Singapore. And they ripped off pieces of wood from that house and had a fire on the beach. Right. And so there are these like very peculiar and particular stories. He has a last chapter, I think, or second last chapter, where he's very interested in the dunes and the geological history of the lakeshore. And he has these, you know, pretty standard scientific theories of the era for how they were formed and what they're doing. He would just love to sit out there and enjoy the nature of the lakeshore. But of the lighthouse in particular, no, I don't think so. I mean, it might appear in the story as we were walking towards the lighthouse or something, but he doesn't. Yeah.
But no focus particularly on it. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? You know, we're a relatively small group. We encourage you to put it in the chat, but if you want to unmute and just ask a question, go ahead and do that. For Michael to ask a question about his book or Holland's folk history. Give you a moment. I think everybody needs to read your book and then they'll have more questions for you.
Hi, Michael. This is Don Cinema.
Hey, Don.
Yeah. You mentioned that folk history is basically local history, and yet the title of your book gives no indication of where Ray Nies lives or where this history is occurring, or even the time period. I'm wondering why you didn't include that kind of information in the title.
That's a very good point. We thought about various different titles. Ray originally titled the manuscript something like the Western or the County Storekeeper, something like this, because at the time they thought of Michigan in the West and they thought of it as very rural area. When Bob and I came up with the title together, and yeah, I realize it's pretty generic. It probably would have done us much better had we specified Holland, Michigan, or give it an era or time. Yeah, I wasn't as strategic as I could have been with sales or titling this the proper way, but uh, I think Bob came up with the Village Talk title, and I agreed with that and said we had to put some folk element in there. And I guess the best we can hope for is that it spreads through word to word that this is a valuable piece of work, But I do hear the criticism, and yeah, that's something that I could have come up with a better title, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, anybody who runs across the title, it gives no location, so it's difficult to identify with if, unless you have that background knowledge.
Yeah, and you can shoot yourself in the foot two ways, because if it is just Holland, Michigan, then it's only going to sell and be read by people in Holland, Michigan. And so we were hoping maybe that this could get picked up by the Michigan History magazine and others to promote it as a wider regional story.
But even Michigan is not listed, so.
Oh yeah, good points.
Any other questions?
One thing is I would have loved to have had an illustrator to describe some of these characters. Of course, that's an extra added cost. And this is something I looked into a long time ago, and then I discovered that artists are very expensive to have draw this out, because when I read the stories, I get these images, wagons with their wheels falling off, and particular rooms in the hardware store where they manufacture this or that, and places and people. And I would love to have images that were associated with those. Of course, they would have to be imaginary, because most of the things he's talking about we don't actually have images of. The book itself is pretty well illustrated. I mean, I can't remember how many we have, 30 or 40 images or something, because we use lots of things to illustrate adjacent areas and people of the town and provide general historical observations that could help the story. I was going to say one more thing, but okay, you say, Linda, the Nies hardware building is now in Seasoned Home store now. I've been away from Holland for so long, I don't think I've been to the Seasoned Home store.
I guess another one of those home stores. They pop up everywhere now.
Well, it used to be, it was like 10 years ago, it used to be ice cream stores downtown. We went from having 0 to 5 ice cream stores like overnight. I don't know how many there are anymore.
I'm sure at least 2. But and then there's all coffee shops now. So and breweries. So yeah, those are the main things now. So the pictures you included in with the book, those are just, historical photos and things that you were able to locate to go along with the stories?
Yep, some of them are Nies family specific and Holland, Michigan specific. We also have some general just American history photos, because he talks about particular eras and people and time. He talks about Jefferson Davis, for example, and Grover Cleveland, and so we provide some information about who these people were and where they were from. The once again, to come back to the Piet Van Liere, the veterinarian, it was only after I had read this manuscript a number of times years ago that I started doing research about him, and I discovered his picture in the newspaper. And, you know, those are the moments as a historian where you realize, wait a minute, this wasn't made up. You know, these, and people have asked me that too. How much of these stories are made up and how much are true? I would say a good portion of it, maybe all of it is true. The names are mostly authentic, although he's remembering these names. So one example I gave last year was I don't know, a nibblink becomes a nibbling or something like that. You know, there's a small change in the pronunciation that changes a letter of the name, or he doesn't remember the guy's first name correct. He calls him John instead of Pete, but it's still true to form who this person was. And even the story about Piet Van Liere in his statement, he would always say the same thing, "'Tis in cot in America." And it's, I can't find the exact translation of that, but you know, it means it's just a mess in America. I found an old Holland City newspaper clipping in which the newspaper editor, so before this was microfilmed, they had the hard copy of the newspaper in front of them, and the editor himself wrote on that clipping, "'Tis in cut," right on top of that guy. So it was common knowledge in Holland, Michigan, that old Piet Van Liere had this saying, you know. And I just kind of wonder, like, what other people were walking around Holland, Michigan, or are walking around today, in which you know, they're going to fade away from the scene, and who are these peculiar characters that we should remember and write stories about, you know. Yeah, Linda notes that for some names he would also use just Mr. K or such. Yeah, I think sometimes out of maybe embarrassment for the person, or maybe just out of inability to remember, he wouldn't use the full name of a person.
All right, any other questions for Michael? Oh, any comment about the explosion at Hope College?
So you mean the dynamite explosion that's mentioned in the book, or is there a recent explosion at Hope College that I don't know about? Okay.
Yes, she wrote yes. No, there's nothing recent.
Yeah, I forget what year this was. I think it was 1917 or something, wasn't it? Right during, around or before, well, the US was in World War I. If you look at the Hope College Anchor, the newspaper, or the Holland City News at the period, they mention that, I don't know, on some random Friday in 1916, that there was an explosion at Hope College that shook or broke all these windows and caused this great havoc. And the police were investigating this, and nobody knew what it was. And this crime, as far as I know, was never solved. Nobody ever knew what this was. Now, Ray wrote about this 23, 24 years later, and he said, you know, I think I know the answer. I don't want to get him in trouble, but there was this young student at Hope College who came into the hardware store, and he said that he needed some dynamite because his father, the farmer up in Borculo or something, had trees that they needed to dynamite the stumps out of the ground. And so Ray says, I sold this young kid some dynamite. And it was, I can't remember the story exactly, but I think it was accidental. He had them outside at Hope College, and he didn't know how explosive dynamite was. He thought it was more like a firecracker or something. And so when it actually went off, it caused a big scene. And so you know, one of the stories is everybody is in World War I mentality, and they're thinking, have the Germans attacked Holland, Michigan, somewhere on, I think it was over by, in my mind, it was over by Voorhees Hall, but I'm not sure, on like 9th Street there, but could have been somewhere else.
I'm sure it caused quite a bit of excitement. My goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay. Any other questions? Deb posted that she's excited to read the book. So,
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I will encourage everyone to go read the book. And Michael, I'm interested in this other project about the Diary of Hoyt Post, and maybe next time we have you on, hopefully we can do it in person, have you back in Michigan for a little bit. So yeah. So, but thank you so much for being here with us this evening and sharing this really interesting manuscript with us, and such an interesting insight into the history of Holland and some of its many rich characters and citizens. So I know I'm looking forward to reading it as well. So I think if anyone has any other questions, it's your last chance to get it in there. But
it's a pleasure, Michelle, and I just wish you guys luck with this whole series. And once again, greetings to, I know, half the people in the chat, so it's nice to see all you guys again. And,
well, it's lovely to see you too. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for being here this evening. As I said, this is being recorded, so it'll be on the Holland Museum website in a few days, so you can share it with other people. But thank you to Michael Douma for being with us again. Hopefully we'll have him back. So we appreciate all of you being here. Thank you very much. Good night.